a great matchup against Magnus. They have played so many times against each other, and there you go. The game starts, and we have a Carol on the board. Well,
we do,
yeah, sorry.
No, go on. And I was just going to say that, are you surprised that Alireza starts thinking after this third move by Magnus? Because this is still standard mainline.
Indeed. So the advanced variation in the Caro-Can has become but the main continuation against the Caro. So the theory has moved on, probably because of the reason that the old line Knight C3 is considered to be, pretty safe for Black because of the so-called Tartakova variation. Black has pretty good reputation here and good results. That's why here the theory now suggests grabbing space with E5, and here Black's options are pretty limited with C5 and Bishop F5. So Magnus played Bishop 5 pretty quickly, and H4 C5. This is one of the sidelines, so Magnus is not going to play the typical move H5, and he's immediately attempting to complicate matters here in the game. But actually, I think that Firouzja, probably Tanya was slightly surprised by the opening choice, because how many times Magnus has played Caro? I think he basically plays everything.
He plays everything, and that's what makes it so hard to prepare against him. But I understand what you say, because we don't see it that often. Yes, he plays everything, but when was the last time I saw Magnus play the Caro? I'm not sure. I'll have to rack my brains for that. The other thing about modern chess and the younger generation is that H4, push Harry the H-pawn at any point of time is a good move, apparently. We see that already on the board, so Alireza not shying away from any concrete direct lines. And now, after sacrificing that pawn on C5, Magnus is putting pressure on that E5 pawn. I'm not very familiar with this H4 move. Arthurs, what can you tell us about this opening?
Yeah, H4 move, this is one of the trends in many openings. If I would go back here while the players are still thinking, you just basically want to trap the bishop. So if Black plays something like E6, there's an idea to play G4, Bishop E4, F3, Bishop G6, H5. That's why the common response here after H4, Black typically plays H5. Trying to stop this and then play E6. So C5 is something sharper. Temporarily sacrifice the pawn, apply pressure against the pawn on E5. So Black very often is perfectly happy playing down a pawn, and then at some point along the way he gets back the pawn on C5. If he does not, well, I suppose he has a lot of activity. All we need to know that this is big theory here. After Bishop E5, Queen C7, Knight F3 makes perfect sense. You hold on to the pawn on E5. Black plays here E6, Bishop E3, and now if my memory is not totally hazy, I think one of the core ideas in these positions, Tanya, is to play Knight H6, try to threaten with Knight G4, but what happens after that, to be honest, I already don't remember.
That's a really cool point you make about bringing that knight to the edge of the board. But I was actually going to say that, that E5 pawn is so important. And pinning this knight to F3 also seems like a move that has to be on your radar. Now, the big question will be, will that knight from G8 jump over to H6, eyeing that F5 square? Or will he find its way perhaps on the same square via E7 as well, which is always an option in these positions?
Yeah, and here also White needs to figure out, is he willing to give up the pawn on E5? Because that's why the greatest players in the world, they know when to accept the pawn for free, and then they're not going to hold on to it, but in my language, use the right moment to sell it back for the right price. Sometimes White is pretty happy, give up the pawn on E5. For example, he's going to play C3 and Bishop E2, allow Black to collect the pawn on E5, but with B4, with the help of modern engines, obviously this is home prep, prove that he has the better position. By the way, Knight H6 was played.
Great call there. So he chooses the H6 square, lands at the center of the board, and look at the way Alireza is hanging on to that E5 pawn. He's doing everything to make sure that when he does give it up, as you said, he gives it with interest. And always watch out for that H pawn advancing further down the board. H5, H6 ideas are on the card as well right now. And let's not forget, Alireza, for the moment, has an extra pawn in the position. So Magnus still has to prove his compensation.
Indeed, he does. So Queen A4 I like this move because this applies some pressure to black. So the first threat is to threaten to take on c6. I make sure that black cannot recapture on c6 with the queen. Also, there's a hidden threat to, at some point, to hit the bishop on g4. But to be honest, Tanya, I'm not really sure how to execute it because this bishop on d4 has no good squares to retreat to make this threat happen. But I mean, you never know. Maybe in a couple of moves.
Sometimes a bad bishop is actually a good bishop. That bishop on d4, it doesn't have open diagonals, but it's doing a great job of defending key central pawns for white, the c5 pawn and the e5 pawn. Right now, Alireza decides to trade off that knight on c6, and Magnus, he pauses. Queen trade, nah, don't want it. I'm down a pawn. He decides to keep the queens on the board, and now the b file is opened up as well to start targeting the b2 pawn. Alireza continues to play fast and creatively. He attacks that bishop on g4. And authors, if you go bishop h5, g4, incoming.
Indeed. So this probably, this could actually explode pretty quickly. Knight h2 is a very, very creative way to spicy up things. And since Alireza played it so quickly, he probably is within the prep. Knight e4, Magnus played very quickly. I was wondering actually what happens after some non-human moves like h5. I would see some immediate f3 on the board. Is this bishop trapped? Under attack after bishop takes on h4. Complete mess on the board. Okay, it doesn't really matter because knight e4 was played, and now probably Magnus can just retreat with the bishop. Getting by the way, because g4 is still going to be a threat.
g4, h5. It's coming. So I'm not sure how Magnus wants to handle these problems. And I've noticed in the Champions Chess Tour, it was Maxime who beat Magnus twice in the last season, then Alireza did it this time. It's always in these chaotic positions. It's always in these positions where the chances for both players to go wrong is very high. And getting these early on, by the way, bishop f5, g4 played. How does Magnus Carlsen keep the balance here?
There is a hidden resource, Tanya. I'm not really sure what it does, but it's bishop c2. But to be honest, after bishop c2, rook c1, where do you go next? Not really sure, but I start to like here Alireza's position because it seems that this bishop is trapped. So could it be that Magnus made a mistake? Knight takes on d4, because now again, if he plays bishop g6, h5, if you play bishop c2, rook c1, if you play bishop e4, I can actually consider f3, but even this position just feels great for white. Extra pawn, castle short, put the knight on f3, and just enjoy the extra pawn.
And Magnus on the camera looks like he's not enjoying his position at all. Big questions being asked early on in the game. Alireza playing concrete chess, g4. Not too many squares for the bishop.
Yeah, I'm a bit puzzled what happened here. Obviously, Magnus thinks it at a different level. I'm only thinking from the casual GM's perspective. Magnus is definitely thinking 2800 plus. So it's very easy for me to call that he mixed up something. But sometimes this happens when you are playing an opening and you think you know the moves, but the variation looks very similar. And let's say with a couple of moves or one move included, knight x on d4 seems to be the correct move. And then after g4, you're supposed to have something. And then when you get it on the board with this move order, you look at this, you're like, wait, it's actually not working, right? So I'm not really sure what happened here. Wow, f6.
Whoa. The bishop was attacked. Magnus doesn't care, literally doesn't care. And he's going for all-out compensation in the center. He says, you take my bishop, I'll take the pawn on e5 with the pawn, and we're going to see this being played out. It's a piece. What a creative sacrifice. I see that Ivalbar doesn't give a massive advantage to Alireza being up a piece. The f5 pawn will fall next, so Magnus will have this huge pawn storm in the center. How do you evaluate this compensation, Arthurs?
To be honest, I don't think it's enough. I'm slightly stunned, to be honest. I try to understand what's going on because it feels a very creative way to solve the problems, but I quite don't buy it. So if I'm going to play queen e3 here, which seems to be the obvious move, right? I'm removing the queen. Does Magnus want to take the rook? He probably wants to play rook takes on f5, e4, rook f8, apply some pressure here. And with the knight on h2 out of the game, probably he has some compensation, but in the long run, I mean, Tanya. I mean, a piece is a piece after all, right? And white is going to castle long. I would pick
I
white.
think he would be also very tempted to take. He does take with the rook. I would be very tempted to take with the pawn. Magnus goes with the idea of the open file that you pointed out. I think, authors, that he went for this line because the alternatives were not pleasing to him at all. Those other variations where you give up a pawn and try and defend that position, it's not what Magnus wants. He wants to play for activity. It feels like it was more of a desperation than an inspired sacrifice.
This is pretty unusual for Magnus. I mean, sometimes this happens, especially in the first match, because he's not yet in the rhythm, right? In the very first game, and then he picks up and he crosses everybody as he typically does. But yeah, this is quite surprising. So maybe I was right. Maybe he did mix up something. This earlier move, and he played it pretty quickly. Again, this knight takes on d4. He didn't really consider anything else. There were other moves, right? There was this crazy move h5, f3, bishop h4. Maybe it made sense consider here bishop h5, g4, and now sacrifice the piece in a different way. But now, could it be that he just missed this g4 from this version, and then came the desperation sacrifice? A bit unusual.
Wow. So rook takes bishop and he goes with long castle now. Alireza touching the 4-minute mark. That knight from h2 will jump back into the game, either via g4 or f3 and start targeting the e pawn. And the point is, and you could do it now as well, defending the f2 pawn. If black was to push e4, you give away a key d4 square as well. To me, it doesn't feel like enough compensation. White has got the open g line. I'm looking at ideas of trying to get to the black king as well. You're pointing out f3, knight g4, keep everything solid. Then think about the attack. Hard to imagine this being enough compensation for Magnus.
I don't think there's any compensation, to be honest. And we have the evaluation bar, of course, which confirms it. But materially wise, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4. This is one of my favorite strategies, how I count material. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Obviously, not enough. Not enough material for the sacrificed piece. Maybe Alireza right now is trying to figure out what to do with the pawn on h4. If he plays knight g4, Tanya, he needs to watch out for e4, because e4 allows black to fix the gaze on the pawn on f2 and stop white from playing f3. And there you go, f3 is immediately played by Alireza. But the question is, now what happens after bishop takes on h4? Because I noticed that after knight g4, there's a bishop g5 threat, and there's some pins. So if Alireza is doing this, probably after bishop takes on h4, he's ready to play some sort of a rook d to g1, stopping bishop g5, and then somehow bring the knight in the game. Not entirely sure.
Makes a lot of sense. I like the move rook g1. You line up your rooks on the open file, one on the h line, one on the g line, stop that threat. Also eyeing ideas on g7. You can always sidestep with your king to b1, bring that knight to g4 on the next few moves. Magnus, he's got 2 pawns currently for the piece, but he's got these double pawns, not clear where the mobility is. He keeps putting pressure on that g5 square, really wanting to get that bishop to g5. But also, it's not a big threat, right? You could, for example, bring your knight to the game. Knight g4 is still possible.
It is, but now the question is what happens after bishop g5, Tanya, because after bishop g5, the queen on e3 actually serves a very important purpose. It controls pretty important squares around it, but also the pawn on c5. So Magnus could play bishop g5, kick away the queen away from the e3 square and collect another pawn. But even with that, I think it's simply not enough, because there's not enough pawns for the sacrifice material. And Alireza here, what he's trying to do, he's trying to normalize the position. By the way, also rook f3 suddenly could become an option in some lines, because you see knight f3 is a pin, the king here is pin. Magnus still has some tricks here, but the position looks pretty dangerous.
Yeah, rook takes pawn looks a bit scary, because at first, I would just want to grab that e5 pawn. But if my knight leaves g4, then you got ideas of rook f2 coming in, piling on the pressure on that pinned knight on d2. So Magnus here slowing down. He can pick up the c5 pawn. He can pick up the f3 pawn. He's making a decision. And Alireza now at 2.5 minutes. There's still questions to be solved. Practical problems. Magnus is always doing that. You know, regardless of the position he lands himself up in, he's always posing questions and problems to his opponent.
The problem for Magnus is that he cannot capture both pawns at the same time because the rules of chess clearly state you can capture one pawn at a time, right? So you would love to take the pawn on f3 or the pawn on c5, but I mean, you gotta choose. Also, please do not underestimate White's very active rooks here at the h and g files. Maybe Alireza is thinking about some very interesting ideas like queen h2, asking a lot of questions. How do you deal with a pawn on h7? Queen c5 is on the board.
It's on the board, and the first thing that comes to mind is that this gives White the chance to grab the pawn on e5. Yes, you can take that knight on d2, but White always has the king to recapture it. So knight takes e5, defending that f3 pawn. I'm always eyeing that bishop on g5. Knight d7 is a threat in the air. Watch out for that as well. What does Magnus have in mind for knight takes pawn? And I also saw our featured chat earlier. I don't know if Arthurs, you might have missed it. It said Magnus's first mistake in this was to go 1c6. Apparently, Caro can't.
All the Caro fans, no, it's not a mistake. No, come on, Caro-Kann is a great defense. King b1. Okay, that's a pretty slow move.
So something Alireza did not like about capturing that pawn on e5, perhaps something that I'm missing, tactics on the board. E5 still lose, he simply sidesteps, and Magnus says no more e5 for you.
Yeah, but also we have to look at the clock because Alireza is now down to the last 2 minutes and Magnus is still ahead by 2 minutes. He sort of has some sort of initiative here. Yeah, King b1 apparently is a miss. Why it's a miss? Now I just checked with an engine. Engine was saying that h5 was the best move here, which is a quite counterintuitive move with the idea that now if you play knight e5, bishop takes on d2, you see suddenly you're going to take on d2 with a king, and now the game starts to get complete mess with knight g6, bishop e3, knight f8, bishop g1, etc. Doesn't really matter, so Magnus decided not to do it, and instead he played queen e7, probably freeing way for the pawns.
And the computer helps us out once more with the best move. You retreat the knight only to come forward next. Knight f2, you want to get it to that d3 square where you're not only targeting the e5 pawn, but the bishop on f4 as well. That's a really nice strategic move. Do you think Alireza will find it?
Knight f2 feels to be pretty simple. Also, knight h6 is a very tempting move in many lines. So I think Alireza here needs to figure out, does he want to consolidate the position? Or he wants to use the knight on g4 for attacking purposes. At the moment, what is it? How many pawns is it for the piece? 3 pawns, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 3 pawns for the piece. Technically, it's material balance on the board, but it's not equal, dear viewers, because the piece is always a stronger thing, a stronger material in the middle game. Because you can use the knight as an extra piece to target something. These pawns, they're looking really menacing. They're pretty static, unfortunately, at the moment. If we would go to an endgame, let's say we remove all the heavy pieces off the board, Black's chances dramatically increase.
Agreed with everything you said, but there was a moment when Magnus had just 1 pawn for a piece. He's managed to get 3 now. He's advanced his pawns in the center. Alireza's playing under 1 minute. Things are getting complicated. And how many times have we seen Magnus turn these positions around? Ignore that question mark right now. He's just putting practical problems for Alireza. He wants to push that pawn to a4 to destabilize that knight on b3. He's saying, sure, capture on d5, improve my own pawn structure. I'll simply take back. I'll advance my c pawn. It's not as clear as the eval bar indicates, Arthurs.
Yeah, he's applying a lot of pressure. I think a5 is a bluff, right? So he's using the fact that his opponent is so low on the clock, he challenges him. You're not going to dare to take the pawn on a5. There you go, Alireza says, I dare you. I'm going to take your pawn on a5. Now prove whatever you have. Most likely Magnus had planned some sort of a rook a8, queen a7, applying some pressure here. We're going to see.
I would be terrified to open all these files in front of the king, but not Alireza. He goes for it, and apparently it is the best choice. Now 17 seconds, and Magnus trying to find ways of putting pressure on White's king. The knight simply comes back to b3 if you hit it on the a file.
Indeed. So now Magnus is taking some time to think. Also, there could be some tactical ideas, like maybe position something at the b file with d4, bishop e5, trying to get to the pawn on b2. But the problem for Black is that White always plays knight b3 and shuts the door. So Magnus here probably is looking for a longer sequence of the move. So the position is probably he suspects he is doing terribly, but White has only 17 seconds on the clock. So he's trying to find a longer sequence filled with a lot of tricks. Maybe remove the bishop, play e4, rook f2 ideas, you name it.
Fascinating chess. And right now we do the math. He's got 2 pawns for a piece. So queen a7 played. The knight on c6 would have gotten trapped, far too gone, no way home. So he comes back, gets the knight closer to the king. And knight is not only a great attacker, but a great defender as well. And look at this. He pushes that a3 pawn. Where is the attack? You've got to switch to the b file now. Now that the knight on b3 is not defended by that a2 pawn, are we expecting rook b8? A different approach. He puts the queen on b6. Watch out. If you move that knight, rook takes pawn becomes a reality because the pawn on b2 is pinned.
Yeah, indeed. That's why I think the knight is going to remain on b3. But again, Alireza has to calculate very quickly here what happens after rook f7, rook b7, 4 seconds. This is not the situation you want to be in. With so little time on the clock. Now this rook has to join the attack. But again, you can't do it now. Look at this. The pawn on h7 is under attack in some lines. So the rook on f5 is pinned to defend the king.
I would have blundered that for sure. Queen takes pawn. That is full board awareness. And you need that. The rook on f5, you very nicely pointed out. I love it how you call it pinned right now.
Right, so Magnus, maybe he missed it from afar. No, okay, he's going to go all in. Knight g4 here. Now, immediately there's some tricks with knight h6, e takes on f3. Okay, what's going on here? Can you take on a 3 seconds?
Luckily, the bishop on e3 has that h6 square in control. Alireza now attacking the h7 pawn with his own rook. He's playing on 3 seconds.
Wow, knight a1 with, oh, this is panic. Okay, this was a panic move, knight a1. I think he almost blundered. I mean, he almost lost on time. Knight on a1 cannot be the correct move. And suddenly, just like that, evaluation bar goes in favor for Magnus. Magnus, again, does it. Of course, the game still continues, but how does he do it, Tanya?
He does it over and over again. Magnus Carlsen doesn't only have the unique ability to convert games flawlessly, but turn out around difficult position, difficult games, and find a way to win those. Right now, Alireza with 2 seconds, a position that suddenly looks busted for him. The f-pawn queening, immense pressure on b2. We saw the shake of his head. He's wondering as well, how do you do it, Magnus?
Yeah, and now just like that, it is Magnus who has extra exchange. The knight at a1 is completely off the game. I was trying to pinpoint maybe there's going to be queen b3 fancy move at some point, but Magnus decided not to do it now. There's no need for that. Maybe now play rook f3, make sure that this trick is going to go through. Yeah, Magnus is going to do it. But again, I mean, 15 seconds, he can still misplay this. The king is weak. He needs to be tactically alert. Queen b2. Just like that.
And he goes for a very practical choice where he believes this rook with 2 knights, because look at that knight on a1. It's out of the game. It needs some time to coordinate itself. And the g-pawn is going to start rolling down the board very quickly.
Yeah, this probably is winning again. This poor knight on a1 is not doing anything here. Magnus pulls the king closer to the defense. g3, rook f2, g2. Very easy plan. Well, in the meantime, Alireza has to figure out how to bring this knight in the game. There you go. I think rook f2 is about to happen. Knight e1. Maybe there's some chance for a fortress for Firouzja. The bar says no, there's no chance.
Comes close to that pawn on a6. Magnus was down a piece. He's just turned this whole game around move by move. Now g2 is coming in. He's going to have 2 extra pawns as well. He's going to pick up that knight on e3. He does it. And Alireza Firouzja resigns. Magnus Carlsen also